Alright, we're jumping right into our next game here. This is episode number 2 of the Speedrun series. And against the move d4, I'm going to be playing the Queen's Gambit Declined. I didn't necessarily mention this in the very first episode. But the way I'm going to play the Queen's Gambit Declined is actually going to be to start with the move knight f6. And what I mean by that is if our opponent goes for c4, then I will play e6 followed by d5. We will get a Queen's Gambit Declined type of position. However, if they don't play c4 on move number 2, if they play knight c3 as they're doing in this case, or knight f3, we'll adjust it a little bit depending on what our opponent does. Against the move knight c3, though, we are going to play the move d5, simply stopping white from putting the pawn on the e4 square. And it looks like we've got a Jobava London proponent, worshiper, whatever you want to call it. Lots of people are playing the Jobava London nowadays, due in part to many different courses and YouTubers that are recommending it. Against this particular opening, what I do recommend is playing the move pawn to c5. I like striking at the center right away. Usually what white is angling for is some knight to b5 ideas to attack us on c7. So white decides to take the pawn on c5. However, I don't think this is really that great of an option for them, because they are going to run themselves into some problems not having the pawn on d4 anymore. So we're going to actually push forward our own pawn to d4. And if white moves their knight forward, especially if they had gone to the b5 square, we would have been able to play the move queen a5 check, forking the king and the knight. They decide to go to the a4 square instead, but I think this is also going to run them into problems. There are various ways we can try to take advantage of this knight that's kind of wayward on the edge of the board. I think the best thing we can do probably is just to begin with queen a5 check. White does have the option of playing c3 to block the check and protect the knight. But this is also kind of a common idea from the Queen's Gambit, with colors kind of reversed. If white does play c3, okay, well they didn't play c3. In this case they retreat the knight, we're simply going to take the knight. I'll talk about what we would have done if they had played c3 in the game analysis afterwards. So they recapture on c3 though. We might as well just grab the pawn on c3 with check, and then take the pawn on c5. And simply put, we're just up a full knight at this point. So very large advantage for us. Lots of moves are good at this point. Knight to e4 looks like a pretty solid move, but I'm just going to focus on developing at this particular moment. Let's go knight c6, get the bishop out, grab some space in the center, maybe play g6 and bishop g7. But the main point is we're simply up a piece, and we're just going to look to consolidate our material advantage. So, yeah, no need for any super funny business here. Let's just focus on developing. I'll put the bishop on g7 because I like the look of it aiming towards the rook on a1, especially now that the b2 pawn is gone. Other moves might be fine to do as well, but I'm just going to prioritize developing. We could also move the knight off of f6 right now, but let's just get castled first. White plays the move pawn to e4, okay. I don't necessarily want to take this pawn because they will take my knight on e4, and then if I take the rook in the corner, they'll also get my bishop, so I will have lost my bishop and knight and gained a pawn and a rook. Technically, point count-wise, that's fine for us, but I don't really want to rush into that. I'm going to go for bishop g4, and I'm just going to trade pieces. We'll make the pin, we'll take the knight. Let's get that knight off the board. I can also go knight to e5 and then attack the queen as well as the bishop. Let's just go for that as well. I may not rush to grab the bishop because it could potentially fix white's pawn structure, but we're going to at least kick the queen backwards and see where it decides to go. Maybe next we'll play rook to d8. Okay, they're playing queen to e3. I'm pretty happy to trade the queens given the circumstance. Taking back with the pawn doesn't really seem all that great. Now they have double isolated pawns. I'm just going to line up on the d file towards the two bishops. Taking the bishop on d3 would have also been totally fine, but here I think there's bigger issues. The two bishops lined up. Now I have my choice of which bishop I want to take. I don't think it really makes a huge difference. I'm going to take the one on d2 just so my rook is a little bit more active. And then I'm still threatening the bishop on c4. Probably he should move it back to b3. Then I can take the pawn in the center. They move it to the a5 square, sure. I think we can probably still take the pawn. I can also play a6 and kick the bishop around. The other option is to take another pawn on c2. We'll just go for that one. And yeah, we're up 2 knights, up a pawn as well, I believe. and pretty smooth sailing. They play g4. I can take the pawn on e4. I can also play bishop h6 to target the pawn that's on the e3 square. I think I'll go for that instead. Taking e4 would have also been totally fine. Here, now we can take the pawn with check. We can also take the pawn on g4. We're threatening rook to h2 checkmate. Very difficult for white to stop that. And I think that is going to be it. No way of stopping the checkmate. Okay, we get the pretty quick win on this one. Yeah, this game was definitely clouded by the fact that white got their knight stuck on the edge of the board and lost the piece eventually. But we'll go into the game review. I'll talk about what they could have done a bit better. Let's go ahead and move over there and check it out. All right, so we're at the game review here. We played at a 93.6% accuracy. One great move, no inaccuracies, mistakes, misses, or blunders. Our opponent played at 76.3, so let's go ahead and analyze it here. So d4, knight f6. As I mentioned at the very start of the game briefly, against d4, what I am going to be playing in this particular speedrun series is going to be the Queen's Gambit declined. Usually you'll get the Queen's Gambit declined after d4 by playing d5, c4, e6, and this is essentially the Queen's Gambit declined pawn structure. If white goes knight c3 or knight f3, you'll go knight f6. And this is going to be a position that we will inevitably come across as the speedrun series continues. Personally, I've always had a little bit of an affinity or preference for playing the move knight f6 first. The reason for this is that the way I like to play against the London system is, you know, let's say white plays bishop f4 for the London system, just as an example. Rather than playing the move d5 in this position, I actually like playing the move c5. And then if white plays e3, I like going for the move queen to b6. This particular way of playing is also possible if you start with d5, but personally I like going for this way of doing it, this particular move order. So that's one of the reasons why I prefer to start with knight f6. If white does play c4, then I would play e6, and then d5, and we would pretty much get to a Queen's Gambit declined. If they play knight f3, I would also play d5 in this speedrun. So, even though we're not starting off the d5, this is going to be a speedrun that focuses mostly on the Queen's Gambit declined against d4. If they do something a little bit different on move 2 than playing c4, it might veer a little bit, but that's at least my explanation for why we're starting with knight f6 instead of d5. In this case, our opponent plays knight c3, so we do play d5. Against this setup, it's very important that we don't really want white to just put two pawns in the center of the board for free. So I do still recommend playing d5. And of course, you could get this exact same position if we had just played d5 on move 1 and then knight f6. You would have the exact same position here. So this setup that white's going for is known as the Jobava London system. It is a setup that a lot of people are playing nowadays, especially really at kind of every level of play, quite honestly. I have master level friends. James Canty, for instance, is a good friend of mine, and he has a course on Chessable about the Jobava London system. So lots of people are playing this opening. I think Daniel Naroditsky also plays it from the white side of things quite a bit. It's a perfectly good opening, but I do have certain ways I like to play against it. So one of those ways is by playing a very quick c5 push. And white taking the pawn on c5 is not really the best option. What white will usually do is play the move e3 to protect the pawn. Sometimes they can even play the move e4 to kind of change the pawn structure in a different way. This particular opponent took the pawn, though, which is not a great response, because now we play the move d4, and now it's already pretty awkward for white's knight to find a good place to go. If white moves the knight to the b5 square, we check on a5, and we simply win the knight since the bishop is not protecting the knight. The e2 pawn is in the way. So they would block the check, and we would take the knight. In the game, white played knight a4. We still give the check. And what white should have tried, at least, is they should have played the move pawn to c3, which does block off the check, and it opens up the queen to protect the knight. What we can do here, though, is play bishop to d7 to attack the knight. White probably plays b3 to protect it. We eliminate the knight. We can take the pawn on c3. Apparently e5 is the best move, but I think taking the pawn on c3 with the queen or the bishop or the queen or the pawn is also perfectly good. Black definitely has an advantage here among lots of options that are good, and yeah, black is better off because white's pawn structure on the queen side is compromised. We're going to inevitably win the c3 pawn, get a big space advantage, and black is in good shape here. But at least if white had done this, they wouldn't be down a knight. In the game, they block with the knight, and here we just go ahead and take the piece, take the pawn with check, take the other pawn. We're just up a full knight at this point, and from here it's all about just trying to trade pieces, simplify the position, and the longer the game goes on, usually the more your piece advantage will start to matter. Another way of playing these positions where your head material is that you can also try to, let's say, use your extra piece or your advantage in firepower to attack the opponent's king. That's another way of doing things. In this game, though, I kind of just focused on developing, eventually trading some pieces. I'm very happy to trade the queens, and then white lost another piece later on, and yeah, the game was pretty much decided here. We eventually got the checkmate and won the game. Alright, so let's get into our next game, and we'll check out what happens in that one. Alright, we got game number 2 here for this video. We're playing against Roman Log, rated 728. We're starting off with our ready opening once again, since we are playing white this time. They play the move d5. We are going to go for the move c4. We saw a couple of these positions in the first episode of the Speedrun series. And our opponent plays knight f6. So if you did already see episode 1 of the Speedrun series, well, if you haven't seen it, you might want to check it out. But if you have already seen episode number 1, we had another opponent play this exact same way against us as well. And I did mention in that previous episode that the problem with this for our opponent is that we are able to trade the pawns on d5, and they have to recapture with a piece rather than being able to recapture with a pawn. And now we end up with 2 central pawns versus our opponent's 1 central pawn. And regardless of which piece they recapture with, we're going to be able to attack that piece in the center. So here, because they use the queen, we can play the move knight c3 to harass the queen. Black is going to have to move the queen away somewhere. c5 is really not a great option because this allows us to simply continue harassing the queen. We now put a pawn within one of the 4 central squares. And the queen is hit, so the queen has to move again. And here I'm just going to keep grabbing space, quite honestly. I'm going to go for the move e4, and we've just created a very large center, 2 pawns in the center. We have 2 pieces developed. Our opponent has moved their queen a couple of times already. It's already a pretty good start to the game for us. This queen is also probably going to become more of a liability as the game continues. For instance, we might be able to play the move knight to d5 at the right time. Not right now, of course. Black is protecting that square. Might be able to play knight to a4 at the right time. It might be the case right here even that we can play knight to a4. It's very close to trapping the queen. If we do go knight a4, there's 2 different checks available. If they check on a5, we block. I guess they can swing all the way over to the h5 square, so doesn't really trap the queen just yet, but it is something that black is going to have to be careful about. What I am more so leaning towards here is pushing one of my 2 central pawns and continuing to gain space and kick those knights around. I'm not 100% sure which one is the better of the 2 to push, quite honestly. I think I can probably push both of them in some ways. If I go for e5, I kick the knight, and then maybe once the knight moves away, then I can play knight to d5, but this queen a5 check is still a little bit annoying. Okay, because it's a blitz speedrun, I'm not going to dwell too much on it. I think I'm going to go for d5. Yeah, let's go d5. I just have to pull the trigger on one of them. This also does open up the idea maybe of bishop e3 to attack the queen in the future as well. So the knight can't stay in the center. It has to move kind of away from the middle of the board. Now I think I can go ahead and continue with the move bishop to e3. I think we can just pester the queen. And the queen only has 2 safe squares to go to. If the queen goes to the d6 square, the move e5 will fork the queen as well as the knight. And if the queen goes to the a5 square, then I think... yeah, now I think black can run into trouble based on their queen location once again. I think I can go for the move a3. I think that this is fine. The knight has to move pretty much back to the a6 square unless he wants to start sacrificing material. And then as far as I'm aware, I think I can just go for b4, and the queen runs out of squares here. There might be other moves that are good too. He is pretty much going to have to sacrifice the knight for the 2 pawns. and then we're going to have a material lead with a pretty substantial advantage. So we take the knight, they take back. Now our knight is pinned and attacked. The pawn on e4 is also attacked at the same time. There's probably multiple moves that are pretty good here, to be honest. The one I'm going to go for, I think, is probably just the simplest in my opinion. I think I'm just going to play the move queen to d4. No need to get fancy, no need to do anything super crazy. You don't win, you don't get bonus points for winning a game with style points or, you know, with fancy attacks or tactics or stuff like that. If you win the game, it doesn't really matter the way you get the job done. So I was happy to just trade the queens. Without the queens on the board, a lot less potential counterplay to worry about. Black is trying to avoid the trade of queens, though. I think the problem with this is I can go, let's say, rook to b1, defended by the knight. Queen is going to have to move away. And then knight to b5 is probably going to start to create trouble because I'll be attacking both the queen and the pawn on c7. And I think inevitably black's going to run into danger there. Other moves were good here too. I probably could have taken the pawn on a7, probably could have checked on b5. But again, when you have a ton of options that are good, sometimes the most important thing is just to pick one of them and go with it. So let's go knight b5, hit the queen as well as the rook. If black gives the check, I'll block with the bishop. And if the queen comes down here to try to attack the rook, I'll probably play rook a1. Okay, here I'm going to block with the bishop. There's not a great way to keep this pawn protected. If the queen goes to b6, I can just trade the queens and then take the pawn on c7. I'll be removing the defender of that c7 pawn if that happens. And yeah, I think this queen is going to... Okay, so it does decide to do this. I think I'm just going to trade the queens, take the pawn, take the rook, and eventually take the game. If I check here with the bishop, they'll take the knight. And so, yeah, I'll just take the rook. No need to complicate things. We're up a full rook here and 2 pawns at the same time. Or sorry, we're up a full rook and a piece, but down 1 pawn. I guess that's what's going on here. Let's go for... kind of want to set up a bit of a mating net. Bishop b5 check. The king can move up the board a little bit, even though I'm sure that that's very bad for them. Here, I'm going to go for a slightly cheeky mating net setup. My idea is to play bishop to b5, king retreats, and then bishop to c7 checkmate. Probably there's other moves that are good as well, but again, the biggest thing in a blitz game, you don't really want to dwell too much on your thoughts. Yeah, here I think we can get the job done. Guess it's not mate if the king goes to the e8 square, but if he moves up to d7, we'll checkmate on b5. Okay, I think that this is game over. Yeah, looks like a checkmate to me. Okay, so we get the mate. Yeah, biggest mistake in this game is the opponent recaptured on d5 with one of their pieces. They did not reinforce the pawn appropriately. And then once I got the big space advantage in the center of the board, I chased the queen around. I had continued attacking the knights. I really didn't have to do anything super fancy. I just grabbed the big space advantage and just rolled the pawns down the board is really what it came down to. So we'll move over to the game review and check it out, though. All right, looks like we played at a 93% accuracy. And our opponent played at 68.6. Let's go ahead and analyze the game. So knight f3, d5, c4, and our opponent goes for knight f6. Now, chess.com's review, system here does say knight f6 is a book move, but I would probably say it's not a good book move. Let's put it that way. Usually, when you think of a book move or when you think of opening theory, you think of generally the best moves or some of the better options in the positions. Knight f6 is not really a great move because once we take on d5, regardless of how black recaptures, we're going to be able to chase that piece around. So in this game, they took with the queen and we attacked it. In the first episode, one of our opponents took with the knight, and then I was able to attack that knight and kick it around and once again build a big space advantage. And I did also mention in the previous episode that I even looked up the stats in the middle of the video. I think it was something like below the rating range of 1400 or 1600, something like that. Your opponent will play this move knight f6 in like 15, I think it was 15% of games, which is a decently high number for a move that's not very good. So anyways, though, they took with the queen in this case. We attacked the queen. we hit the queen again, grab a big space advantage, and you can already see according to the computer evaluation that we're doing very nicely here. Moving the knight forward was not great. We attack that knight, and then attack the queen, and then attack the knight, and then attack the queen, and then ultimately just through making basic threats that also improve our position at the same time, we're simply able to get a winning advantage, is what it comes down to. Queen to d4 we played. Just like the previous game, I'm very happy to trade pieces when I'm ahead material. Our opponent avoided the trade though, so we kick the queen, we continue attacking the queen. Really nothing overly complicated, we're just attacking all of black's pieces. We attack the knight, we attack the queen, we attack the queen, back and forth, attack the queen once again. Finally, we trade the queens, but we're trading the queens not only because we're ahead material, but also because it gets rid of the defense of the c7 pawn. And now once the king moves away, we take the rook, and eventually we do deliver the checkmate. So, yeah, mostly in these first couple of games so far, just punishing our opponent's mistakes. Let's go ahead and get into our third game and see how that one goes. Alright, getting right into it. So our opponent here is Balbux, rated 726. And they're starting off with c4. Okay, so a little bit surprised, quite honestly, to see a c4 opening at this rating level. Against the, let's say, non-e4 and non-d4 moves, I am going to be playing a bit of a, let's call it like slightly symmetrical approach, especially if they're playing c4 or knight f3. I'm going to play knight f3 or knight f6 against knight f3, and I'm going to play c5 against c4. But that doesn't mean I'm going to copy all of white's moves. In this case, I'm going to play the move knight f6, and I'm going to look to play the move d5 to gain space in the center myself. And what I'm going to try to do here is to get, essentially this is what's known as a symmetrical English when we go for c5 against c4. But as we've seen in the other games, I'm just going to try to fight for control of the center of the board for the most part. Here, for example, by playing d5, if white takes the pawn, I would take back with the knight, and then later on I would try to put the other pawn on the e5 square. If I can get the pawns on e5 and c5 together, we'd have a pretty pleasant space advantage, and we'd also have what's known as a Maroczy bind. We'll talk more about that in future games that might have this position. But, okay, in this game, white did not take the pawn. They played bishop to g2. And I think the drawback to this move is kind of similar to that Jobava London game we played just earlier. I think I can just push into my opponent's half of the board, gain space, and attack the knight on c3. So that's what I'm going to go for. Taking the pawn on c4 doesn't really do a whole lot because the move queen a4 check will fork the pawn as well as the king, so I won't really be keeping the extra material. I'm going to go for the move d4 just to harass the knight and kind of push into push into white's half of the board and be a bit annoying. Okay, so they're playing knight to e4. I'm going to go ahead and make this capture. I'm mainly going to make this capture because after white recaptures, the bishop is in a pretty awkward location. He's probably going to have to move the bishop back before he plays the move knight f3, because if he plays knight f3 when the bishop is out on the e4 square, it's very likely that it's going to run into some kind of awkwardness, you could call it. So my MO, though, once again, is I'm just going to grab space. I'm going to play the move e5. I've got 3 pawns controlling the center of the board. He does play knight f3, which is blocking the bishop in. And I don't have a way to trap the bishop necessarily. I could play f5 here to hit the bishop. It can sit on the d5 square for a moment, I suppose. But inevitably, this bishop will become a problem. I don't think I want to attack it yet because I don't really have a great way to attack it when it's on d5. But this f5 move is definitely a move we'll be thinking about in the future. So I think I'm going to start with bishop d6 first, just to guard the pawn. Castle the king. Maybe try to control the d5 square first before I play f5. But yeah, this is a very awkwardly placed bishop, no question about it. So he plays d3. It's almost like he's asking to get trapped here somehow. But once again, if we play f5, he'll play bishop d5. How do I want to do this? I think I will... I think I'm going to go for knight c6. It is possible for white to take my knight and mess up my pawns, but it's going to cost him this light square bishop that's already moved, 2 different times. It'll have to move a 3rd time if he wants to take the knight. He's playing the move b4. Not really sure what that's about necessarily. I think now I will strike with f5. If he takes the knight, that's fine. If he moves the bishop to d5, now I can play the move knight to e7 to harass the bishop. And now the bishop is very low on squares. I'm not necessarily threatening to win a piece because the bishop is protected, but I would really like to take this bishop, and then the pawn on d5 will become a liability that white's going to have to worry about. So he plays knight g5, he wants to fork. We're going to eliminate the bishop so that that's not a problem. And I think here I will go for the move. Let's see. I think he might play knight e6 in the near future. Let's go queen e7 first just to control that square a little bit better. And then I'll castle, kick the knight, and inevitably try to win this pawn on d5 later on down the road. Okay, he castles. I think I'll play h6 first. I might as well just kick the knight backwards. If it moves forwards, we'll just take the knight. Okay, if he wants to do that, that is fine with me. Now I'm just up one pawn. And now I think I'll just go ahead and castle. And yeah, so we are ahead one pawn. Not as much material ahead as we were in some of the other games, but one pawn is still quite good to be ahead. Our opponent's playing the move b4. I think rather than taking this pawn and helping white to open up their rook, I think I'm going to push forward with c4. If they take me, I'll take back. And then I'll start to try to, I'll start working towards mobilizing these pawns in the center, is my game plan. I also can put the queen on the d5 square if I'm ever attacked, which is pretty safe. He goes queen to c1. Now, I can take the pawn on e2, which looks okay on first glance. There might be some kind of bishop takes h6 funny business, where my bishop is hid and the check is available. I think here I'm just going to simplify things and I'm just going to trade queens, especially given the time situation. And I'm just going to look to trade. Really, that's all it is. So let's go rook to c8. Happy to trade rooks. Happy to trade bishops. Pretty much happy to trade anything. I'm probably going to run the king up towards the center of the board at the right time. I think here I'll play the move d3 just to create this passed pawn. I can always play e4 to reinforce it. And this bishop is going to have to be careful kind of blocking the pawn. Rook goes to c3. I'm happy to trade rooks when they're not able to recapture with their rook right away. Let's go rook to c8 to attack the bishop. And then probably I'll play e4 pretty soon. In this case, I'll hit the bishop first. And then I'll play e4. And yeah, this pawn on d3 is a very big asset. I can also play rook to a2 pretty soon. I can walk the king up the board. I think I'll prioritize the king first. Let's get the king in the game. Yeah, I'm just going to run the king towards the middle of the board to begin with. Okay, I'm going to play h5 just to freeze his pawns. None of these can move forward. And yeah, we're in good shape. I can also play bishop e5 to c3 to trade off that bishop. I'm going to focus on just getting my pieces up the board. I think I will try to trade the bishop pretty soon. His bishop also can't move without losing the pawn, so he's got to worry about that. Okay, well, if he's going to give me the pawn, that's fine. Now I can play rook f3 to attack this. Let's go rook f3. He's probably going to give a check. That's fine. Going to take the pawn on g3 next move. I can also take the pawn on e3 and then start pushing the pawns forward. All right, we'll take with check here. Then I think we'll take with check here. Then check here. Push the pawn. Check here. Continue pushing. Okay, move the king. Move the king again. Give this check as mentioned. Push this for a check. He takes with the bishop, I'll take with the rook. Now I can check on g3 next move. Move the king up to the f3 square, and there's really nothing he can do to stop rook to d1 checkmate. That's going to be that. I didn't even really need the e3 pawn to push down the board, but pushing that pawn would have also been completely winning as well. Okay, so we get the job done. A little close for comfort on the time situation, but we were completely winning the entire time. I was up a pawn, moving my king up the board. We got the job done, though. That's what really matters here. So, yeah, let's go ahead and move over to the game analysis, or the game review, and check it out there. All right, we played at a 92.2% accuracy. We had two inaccuracies, I suppose, is what it shows. Probably somewhere in the time scramble at the end, I would assume. But yeah, let's go ahead and analyze the game. So, c4, as mentioned during the game, against e4, I'm good. Well, I'll put it this way: against e4, I'm going to be playing the caro-kann. Against d4, I'm going to be playing the Queen's Gambit decline setup. And against c4 and knight f3, I'm going to be playing, like, kind of, you could say, copycat on move number 1. Against c4, I'll play c5. Against knight f3, I'll play knight f6. But I am going to try to combine the two moves. Against knight f3, I'll go knight f6, then c5. Against c4, I'll go c5, then knight f6. You'll kind of see, like, a little bit of a copycat in that regard. But okay, in this case, I go c5. This is what's known as the symmetrical English. Knight c3, knight f6, g3, d5. White's best move is to take the pawn on d5. If they do take the pawn, and then they play bishop g2, this is a better setup for them to go for. Here I would retreat the knight to c7, and then look to expand in the center and gain more space. Again, we'll probably see some examples of this in the future, in future games, I would guess. Instead, though, my opponent went for bishop g2 right away, and the downside for this move order is that we do get to play d4, very similar to that Jobava London game we played earlier, from Black's perspective. We gain space, we attack the knight, and the knight is kind of having some awkwardness in terms of where to go. White went to e4. I traded the knights. I did gain space. White played knight f3. I defend the pawn. It's very close to being a trap piece. However, it's a little bit hard for us to attack the bishop on the d5 square right away. So I decided to hold off on doing that for a little bit. I went bishop d6 first. Then knight c6, and then I did finally go for f5. After bishop d5, we attack the bishop once again. And the best move for white is to play the move bishop to g5 to pin the knight so that we can't take the bishop. And pretty much according to the computer, that's white's only good move. But we can already see that white's in a bit of a difficult spot regardless, because similar to the other games, I've got a very large space advantage in the center of the board. Pawns on f5, e5, d4, c5. In one of the other games, I pushed the pawns up to e4, d4, kick the opponent's queen around, kick the knight around. Here it's maybe not as drastic because I'm not attacking as many pieces in the process. But we still have a very large space advantage, and this is what is giving us the advantage at this point. Knight g5 is not that great. We do eliminate the bishop. Move the queen to e7, hit the knight. Now we're simply ahead one pawn, which is nice for us. And now it's all about just converting the advantage that we're given. So many moves are good here. b6 apparently is also fine. I went for c4. White did make the trade. If white doesn't take the pawn, I was going to push up to c3 and have that pass pawn lodged on that c3 square, which is really nice and protected. So white took, we take back. They offer the trade of queens. Apparently taking the e2 pawn is possible. I think, as I mentioned, maybe white can try bishop takes h6. And the computer says the best way to play is just not take the bishop. I did say during the game that taking the bishop, yeah, at least my instincts were good here. Apparently this is now just a very equal and probably just a drawish position. Mainly because white's threatening the perpetual check, and they're also attacking the bishop at the same time. And there's really not a great way to defend everything simultaneously. So, anyways though, I traded the queens, offered a trade of rooks, got the pawn up to d3. This is a very strong pass pawn, and this is essentially my extra pawn if you look at it that way. White's got 4 pawns here, 2 pawns here. We've also got 4 pawns matching those, 2 matching those, but the pawn on d3 is the extra pawn that we have, and that ends up being kind of the biggest asset in our position as the game progressed, as we saw. So he goes to c3. I was happy to trade the rooks, hit the bishop, improve the rook, lock the pawn on d3 into being protected very stably, and then lots of ways to win from here. I just decided to move the king up the board. Eventually, I was planning on playing bishop to c3 to trade off the piece that's blockading the pawn. Usually, if you have a pass pawn and your opponent's blockading it, it's usually good to trade off that piece so that you can move the pawn forward. And once they did move it out of the way, we took the f2 pawn, eventually the g3 pawn. We're just up a bunch of pawns here. And when you are ahead pawns, especially in the later stages of the game, you want to start pushing those pawns. You know, I'm ahead 2 pawns. Actually, I'm ahead 4 pawns in this position, and I'm pushing all of them. I'm pushing the D pawn, the E pawn. Could also maybe push the F pawn if I wanted to. Eventually, white had to give up the bishop to stop one of the pawns from promoting, and we eventually got the checkmate. So, yeah, this was the 3 games for this episode. We have climbed up to a rating of 772, it looks like. I am gaining points a little bit more rapidly at the start of the speedrun, mainly because I'm not just gaining your typical like 8 to 10 points per game. I'm gaining somewhere in the 20 to 30 points per game range. But as I play more games, that number will go back down to kind of the normal amount of points you gain or lose on it on any given game. So I'm not just gonna breeze through every single game and jump up to like 2,000 rating in some very short amount of time or something. So, anyways, though, hopefully you enjoyed this one. If you haven't had the chance to check out the first episode, you can check out the playlist to the left of the video here. I will be back for the next episode, and I will see you in the next one. Have a good day.